Okay, so today we're going to look at criticisms of emotivism. Best to start just reminding ourselves of what emotivism is. Emotivism is the claim that moral statements, so any kind of statement like that's good or that's bad, are actually just expressions of emotion, not descriptions of emotion, expressions of emotion. So, for instance, as we've covered, when you see someone like lighting a house on fire, you just say boo, or your words, arson is wrong, actually just mean boo to arson. So it's an anti-realist theory, which means that there are no moral facts, and it's non-cognitivist, which means that the moral statements are not truth apt. Okay, so we're going to look at some criticisms today. We're going to look at three of them. I think we're going to start with the problem of persuasiveness in moral thinking. Now, G.J. Warnock argues that morality is meant to be persuasive. Moral statements are persuasive. So when I say arson is wrong, I'm trying to convince you of something here. It's not just an expression on my own. You are meant to try and convince others. Now, to give emotivism its credit, there are emotive sentences that attempt to persuade. Warnock gives the example of advertising. In advertising, you have a whole load of emotive sentences, because you're worth it, and so on. But moral statements, and this is really his criticism, moral statements, they're not, I'll put this, are not emotively persuading. He says, and I quote roughly here. He says words like "that's good" or "that's bad" don't exactly quicken the pulse. So, if emotivism is right and moral statements really are just expressions of emotion, then they're not very good at fulfilling what we would see as one of the basic requirements of moral statements, which is that they persuade. I think linked to this non-cognitivist issue, is Mackey's attack specifically on non-cognitivism. Now, remember that Mackey is an anti-realist, but he is also a cognitivist. This is because he thinks that we behave as if there are facts, there are moral facts. Now, this as if is really important. Remember, he is an anti-realist, but he is also a cognitivist. And he thinks that we behave as if there are moral facts because they appear to come from the outside world. So they appear to be external. Now, they're not external, he thinks, and like facts are external, but they're a bit more external than, say, obvious internal emotions are. He says they come ultimately from two sources. They come from projection and society. Now, by projection, he means, he gives the example of seeing something disgusting. I think he gives the example of mucus. He says, you see mucus, it's gross. That's actually an emotive response, but you project the disgustingness onto it. I, for instance, am absolutely terrified of spiders, right? Now, my emotional response to that is fear. Okay, that's what's actually going on there. God, that's embarrassing, isn't it? But I'm really, really, really scared of spiders. So that's my emotional response. Ah! But then I think incorrectly that that itself has the attribute of being creepy. When it doesn't. It doesn't actually have creepiness. The creepiness is in me. Well, Mackie says the same is the case with morality. We tend to think that morality is something that comes from without. We project morality onto things. So what he's really saying there is that when we speak of morality, we're speaking of the things. We don't think we're expressing emotions at all. We think we're expressing facts. We think we are making claims about the world, and that's the reason for this first. Oh, that's the wrong colour. That's the reason for this first kind of move towards cognitivism. That he thinks in that way we are expressing claims about the world, not as emotivists claim, just expressing emotion. The other part of this is society. Now, he thinks that society as a whole, everybody else that's kind of raised you, they very much influence your behaviour. There's a kind of group think going on, right? That X and Y are wrong. And then that group think influences your perspective. But society, of course, is exterior. So again, you might think that you're really expressing, at least partly, your society's opinion on various things. Not, again, your emotive response, but rather your societal response. And so again, we have this pretty clear idea that your moral descriptions and the way that we normally use them are cognitivist in nature. They're claims about the world, not, as Emotivism has it, mere expressions of emotion. So it's worth noting, by the way, that this produces for Mackie what he calls his error theory, which is that there are no moral facts, but we speak as if there are, and so we're always wrong. Finally, I want to look at kind of the foundations of Emotivism here. The foundations of Emotivism are the verification principle, and the verification principle says this. It says statements are meaningless unless they are empirically verifiable. So only if they are empirically verifiable are they meaningful. And moral statements are not empirically verifiable, therefore they are meaningless. That's central to to Ayer's argument. But the big problem here, the really big problem that many have pointed out, is that actually this is self-defeating. Now, just as a side note, better talk about what self-defeating is. Self-defeating, oops, sorry about that. Self-defeating is when something contradicts itself or makes itself false. So, an example of a self-defeating statement would be something like, this sentence is false. It is, by definition, untrue. Now, this statement, so the argument goes, is also self-defeating. Because if it's true that statements are meaningless if they're not empirically verifiable, well, this statement itself is not empirically verifiable. Now, that is a big problem. Can you see why? It's because it would call itself meaningless and therefore not be able to spread and affect the rest of our language. So that's the objection, and if that's true, then the rest of emotivism doesn't really follow. There are a few responses that you could give to this, which certainly I think have some validity. So one response is to say that the verification principle is actually just about statements about the world. So it's not about statements about language. So kind of Ayer's defense for the verification principle is that that the world is full of empirical things. Remember, he's a radical empiricist, and so we can only make empirical claims. He's not talking about language there, because language isn't in the world as it is in our minds. So it might be that it's not self-defeating because it doesn't apply to itself, because the verification principle is about language, not about the world. Another response would be that the verification principle is required in order to use language in the first place. So there are some responses. This is set up even though everything else needs to meet the verification principle, so this objection goes, the verification principle itself doesn't need to meet that standard. There are responses to that one. But here we have ultimately three criticisms of emotivism. The fundamental principles on which it bases its ethical theory are flawed. The verification principle is self-contradictory. Non-cognitivism doesn't kind of match the evidence, and an emotive understanding of ethical statements isn't persuasive, and moral statements appear to be and ought to be persuasive.